On this head-spinning day of breaking news in the impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump and the stunning admission from President Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, that despite the president's repeated public denials, the White House did, in fact, hold up nearly $400 million in military aid to Ukraine, conditioned on our ally undertaking an investigation into the Democrats and the 2016 campaign. From the White House briefing room just a couple of hours ago, here is how Mick Mulvaney described the president's decision to withhold that military aid that Ukraine was desperately seeking in the midst of its hot war with Russia.
That he also mentioned to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
Withholding the funding.
Yeah.
Now that, my friends, that is the first time in the Ukraine scandal that a White House official has publicly acknowledged the existence of something that you do not need the 4 years of high school Latin that I suffered through to know is called a quid pro quo. And that, of course, flies in direct contradiction to what the president has been saying over and over again.
There was no quid pro quo at all.
There is no pro quo.
There was no quid pro quo.
There was no quid pro quo, unlike Biden.
The text message that I saw from Ambassador Sondland, who's highly respected, was there's no quid pro quo. He said, by the way, there's no quid pro quo, and there isn't. There was no quid pro quo. There was nothing.
Oh, there's a quid pro quo, all right. And the glaring contradiction and conflict between the president and his chief of staff is just the latest damning development in the rapidly escalating and metastasizing impeachment inquiry, as current and former officials are now testifying at a breakneck clip. Today, as we speak, the sitting U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, who's at the center of many of the flashpoints in the Ukraine scandal, is giving a deposition behind closed doors in the House of Representatives. And Sondland, too, despite being a wealthy Trump donor, previously considered a stalwart loyalist of the president, that man is painting a nasty picture of Trump's conduct when it comes to Ukraine. In an opening statement obtained by NBC News, Sondland makes clear that it was Trump himself who pushed his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to have Ukraine look into the Democrats, saying in his written testimony, quote, "My understanding was that the president directed Giuliani's participation, that Giuliani was expressing the concerns of the president." Sondland goes on to add that Giuliani's goal was to, quote, "involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 re-election campaign." Now, Sondland, of course, is just the latest in a parade of Trump administration insiders, all telling a consistent and damaging story about Donald Trump and the Ukraine. That's quickly taking the president's attempts to erect a stone wall and reducing them to rubble. Joining us now at this table, Chair for the Center of African American Studies at Princeton University, my friend Eddie Glaude. On Capitol Hill, NBC News correspondent Heidi Przybyla, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor, another great friend, Jill Wine-Banks, Matt Miller, former chief spokesman for the Department of Justice, and White House reporter for the New York Times, Michael Crowley. Guys, I'm going to start with you, Crowley, just because you are there in that building where we saw something important today. This week has been just day after day of developments that have, I think, advanced the story materially and in ways that have been strongly adverse to President Trump's interests. Tell me just what the reaction was to Mick Mulvaney today and what you make of what we heard.
Well, I think it was amazement, John. I mean, Mick Mulvaney essentially came out and, copped to a big part of the fundamental accusation around which this impeachment proceeding is built on, which is that there was a quid pro quo involving American government foreign policy towards Ukraine that was connected to the president's fixation on the 2016 presidential election. Now, he said that the quid pro quo did not involve the Bidens and Burisma, but, that doesn't mean, number one, that it was appropriate to condition the aid in this way. And number two, let's accept for a minute Mulvaney's contention that it is appropriate, that this is part of, legitimate. This is a legitimate subject of inquiry, and that politics is part of foreign policy, and get over it, as he put it. Just what is the thing that is the premise here? It's a theory that just is, to be honest, not credible or accepted by virtually anyone who understands what happened in 2016, that suggests that the DNC server that was hacked and which the FBI concludes, and Robert Mueller's report explained in intricate detail how it happened, was hacked by the Russian military intelligence services, was actually somehow this was done by the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians are part of a cover-up because a cyber firm that helped do some of the forensic analysis has some Ukrainian ownership, and maybe the server is in Ukraine. I mean, so even if you accept Mulvaney at his word or his premise that this is a valid subject of inquiry, the backdrop of this, the reason that this would be of interest to the United States is just based on, frankly, what is hard to call anything but a conspiracy theory. So the reaction, I think, was really one of amazement. Number one, that he came out and the story is now changed, that there was a quid pro quo. Right. And then number two, that the White House is basically saying this is a legitimate basis for such a quid pro quo.
Right. So, Matt Miller, I want to come to you because on a number of levels I want to come to you, but I'm going to start with this level, which is we've got the Department of Justice after Mick Mulvaney has said these rather astonishing things, again, in the face of Donald Trump over and over again saying no quid pro quo. Mick Mulvaney comes out and says, oh, yeah, quid pro quo. It's just an okay quid pro quo. We now have a senior DOJ official telling NBC News that the Mulvaney admission is news to us. Here's the quote. If the White House was withholding aid from Ukraine with regard to any investigation by the Justice Department, that is news to us. That seems like a pretty stunning thing on its own there, Matt, just in the sense that this Justice Department coming out and kind of essentially saying the acting chief of staff is saying something here that is in flat contradiction to what we know to be true and what the president has been claiming. We're going to distance ourselves from the second most powerful person in the country. Tell me what you think is going on here.
It is a striking thing for DOJ to do, and I think it's important to note that they went out of their way to do this. This wasn't, questions coming in from reporters. They went out and sent this statement out to basically every reporter on the DOJ beat. They wanted the world to know this today after watching this Mulvaney press conference. And this is the second time they've distanced themselves from the way the White House has handled this. Remember, after the White House released the memo of the conversation that the president had with President Zelensky, where he pushed Zelensky to talk with Bill Barr, the Justice Department put out a statement saying they had no knowledge of that when the president made the statement. That Barr didn't find out about it until weeks after the fact when they got this criminal referral to look into whether the president had committed a crime or not. So, Bill Barr has shown in the past that he'll take a bullet for the president. He very publicly took a bullet for him at the conclusion of the Mueller report. Yeah. But he's not going to take this bullet for him. This one is too much, and they're not going to do it. If they want to find someone else to kind of blame on this or to rope into this scandal, they have to look somewhere beyond the Justice Department.
Matt, do you think the suggestion here is that they're saying Mick Mulvaney is lying, or are they saying Mick Mulvaney may be telling the truth, but if there was some off-the-books foreign policy thing going on related to this investigation, the DOJ just had no part of this whatsoever, and just keep it away from our doorstep?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think they're saying that look, if they were pushing for an if they wanted when the president wanted Ukraine to cooperate into an investigation or to announce an investigation of what happened in 2016, that wasn't the DOJ investigation. That wasn't this thing that Barr has had running with Durham. That is it's a separate conspiracy theory that Rudy Giuliani was running around pursuing on his own. And DOJ, as much as I think Bill Barr's investigation into the origins of the Mueller probe, I think that investigation is inappropriate. What DOJ is saying is what we're doing, it's not the crazy land stuff that Rudy is off pursuing. We want nothing to do with that.
Right. Jill Wine-Banks, I come to you at this point. We have seen, this week, the story of this week has been kind of the story of all the president's men being assembled. We've seen John Bolton put in the middle of this thing, although maybe on the right side of history. We've seen Rudy Giuliani's role expanded. We've seen Mick Mulvaney, who previously had no complicity in any of this, suddenly go from being an outlier figure to being a central figure. And now we have Mick Mulvaney up there, not just contradicting what the president has said, but saying it's legit. for the White House to have done this thing that looks to most people like it's unethical, potentially illegal, all in the service of what everybody with half a brain recognizes is a nuthouse conspiracy theory, not just as crazy as can be. So just as you sit there and think about the analogies we always ask you for, what does this mean to you, what's happened just now today, and where does this investigation go from here?
Well, as a trial lawyer, when the facts are against you, you argue the law. When the law is against you, you argue the facts. In this case, when both the law and the facts are against you, you just make up conspiracy theories. And that seems to be what's going on. Mulvaney really did some damage to the president. Rudy Giuliani is doing consistent damage to the president. And you don't need a quid pro quo, but if you did, there is one. I never thought I'd have to say quid pro quo on television, sort of like I've always wanted to say quaere clausum frigate, one of my favorite legal terms from law school. So now I've done it. I've said it on television. But it's a ridiculous set of circumstances. This is something that we should fall into that sort of hashtag of say this, not that. Let's not say quid pro quo. Let's say shakedown. That's what this is. There was a shakedown for personal political benefit. There was a withholding of something Congress had approved, funding that was necessary. And again, we come back to Russia. It was for protection against Russia. So everything seems to relate back to Putin and Russia. And by withholding the money, he was trying to get support for making up evidence that there is none that anybody knows of to support a ridiculous, as you've called it, theory, conspiracy theory. And that is both criminal and impeachable.
All right. Heidi Przybyla, I want to play a little sound here from an interview that now has become iconic in a way in this investigation, the interview that our friend Chuck Todd did on Meet the Press a couple Sundays ago with Ron Johnson. You're up on Capitol Hill. I want to play this where you heard Johnson, not the part where he was spouting his own crazy conspiracy theories, but the part where he expressed a fair degree of discomfort at the notion that aid would have been linked to any kind of a demand for an investigation. Just let's replay that now.
I'm asking a simple question about you clearly were upset that somehow there was an implication that military aid was being frozen because the president wanted an investigation. Why did you wince?
Because I didn't want those connected. And I was supporting the aid, as is Senator Murphy, as is everybody that went to that initial inauguration. But here's the salient point of why I came forward. When I asked the president about that, he completely denied it. He adamantly denied it. He vehemently, angrily denied it. He said, I'd never do that.
So Heidi, adamantly, vehemently, aggressively, vigorously, the president denied all those things, according to Senator Johnson, And yet now the acting chief of staff has gone on television today to say, actually, it all happened. Just the thing you feared happened, Ron Johnson. In fact, happened. So I ask you, how do we make sense of this, number one? And number two, what do you think Republicans on the Hill where you are now are going to say in light of the Mulvaney fiasco this afternoon?
Well, we are trying to reach out as early, right? I happened to be meeting with a Republican at the time that interview took place. And when I left, I texted him. I didn't hear back, frankly, because I think there's just widespread confusion. My understanding is that it appears that the White House is now hanging on this very flimsy argument that if there was an open Justice Department investigation, as there was on Russia, that somehow these crazy conspiracy theories would be part of that, and that therefore the entire thing was completely above board and legit, that the quid really didn't have to do with the Bidens. That's where they're going with this, okay? You see the Justice Department pushing back on that, and unfortunately for them, the evidence also negates that. We saw that in the transcript that the White House itself released, where the president said, I need a favor. And he went into both the CrowdStrike server and the origins of the Russia investigation. And then he said there's one other thing. And he talked about the Bidens. That's in their own transcript. And then you've got the testimony now that is coming out from numerous officials, including Mr. McKinley, who frankly resigned, a career diplomat of over 20 years, who resigned over the issue. And he says, I quote in his opening statement, I was disturbed by the implication that foreign governments were being approached to procure negative information on political opponents. That is the Bidens that he is talking about there.
Right.
So all of these officials who are testifying very clearly understood that the quid pro quo involved Burisma and the Bidens.
Right. So I want to go back to you, Crowley, and I'm going to play again a little more sound here from Mick Mulvaney. We have not seen Mick Mulvaney ever before do something like this, so it seems like kind of a special day, especially when he's making so much news when he does appear before the cameras. Here's another piece of news he made. In addition to confirming the quid pro quo, he confirmed essentially something that 3 or 4 days ago was considered pretty controversial. The assertion that basically Rudy Giuliani had been tasked with the president to take over basically running a shadow foreign policy related to Ukraine. Let's listen to Mick Mulvaney on that.
Did the president direct you or anyone else to work with Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine?
When was it? There was the May meeting, and I think this has been widely reported. In fact, I think Sondland mentioned it in his testimony, and I'm pretty sure that Rick Perry mentioned it in his interview yesterday with the Wall Street Journal, that in the May meeting in the Oval Office that I was in, I think Senator Johnson was there as well as Mr. Volker was there. The president asked Rick Perry to work with Mr. Giuliani.
So, Crowley, I ask you, that's basically a sort of like, okay, Giuliani's in charge here. We saw reporting in the Washington Post yesterday, 2 days ago now, about the three amigos. There's Rick Perry's name mentioned. Yeah. We are basically having these officials, whether they're intending to or not, come out and confirm, not just on the record, but on camera, some of the most explosive kind of allegations and suppositions that have been floated over the course of the last 2 weeks. This picture is now not just being filled in, but being filled in Technicolor by the players themselves on camera. I'm sorry to say, it's about to make my head explode to see this kind of thing unfolding this way. This is not how scandals are supposed to go.
No, that's right. But, it's, I guess, part of the Trump playbook, which is just he takes on every public fight in ignoring the normal rules, right? And just doing it his own incredibly unusual, sometimes bizarre way. And in this case, the strategy seems to involve, admitting things in public. Like, it's no big deal. I'm up here talking about it in front of the cameras. I'm struck by the way Mulvaney framed that. He said, well, this has been reported. It's almost like, that's kind of out there. That's kind of old news. Yeah, you're right. But, everybody knows this. And it is a big deal to have that admitted from the podium at the White House, that the president's personal lawyer, who is not on the federal government payroll, is instructing government officials whose 2 out of the 3 amigos portfolios are not meant to involve Ukraine in a very major way, are going to be running Ukraine policy, basically looping out the U.S. ambassador to the country. And he just kind of says, like, yeah, that's been reported and that's true. And it seems to be, similar to this admission that there was a quid pro quo on the aid, a strategy of saying things in public in a kind of nonchalant way and hoping that is sort of a form of inoculation. Now, it's not going to work with House Democrats and their impeachment proceedings, but to the extent it's part of the battle for public opinion, maybe they're gambling that's an effective strategy.
Matt Miller, do you think that there's just, you think about during the Russia investigation, one of the things that worked for Trump that's kind of akin to what Crowley's talking about here is the notion that Trump would say over and over again, no obstruction, no collusion, and he would get people to say no obstruction, no collusion. He got Bill Barr to say that over and over again, and eventually some people believe that there was no obstruction, no collusion. But now you've got him saying no quid pro quo, and Mulvaney comes out and basically just lays out a quid pro quo, even as blatantly as the one that's in the transcript from the phone call. Do you think they're just betting on the notion that Americans will never understand what the Latin means? Because I don't really understand how that's what Mulvaney described today is anything other than a textbook quid pro quo.
It absolutely is. Look, I think Mick Mulvaney was trying to do 2 things. One, he was trying to get out ahead of some facts before facts got out ahead of them, especially on this question of withholding aid. It's a personal issue for Mulvaney because he was right in the center of that. He was the one the president directed to withhold that aid, and he's the one that carried out that order. So I suspect what he was doing was trying to put that out and then define it in the best terms possible. And that's what they're trying to do with all of this. They have had to move the goalposts as the facts have moved. And The difference with this scandal and some of the others at the White House is there are witnesses who are coming forward and laying out the facts to Congress. So the White House isn't in the position where they can just deny, and stonewall, and keep the truth from coming out, because the truth is coming out even over their objections. So what they're trying to do now is just redefine what it is that's acceptable. You saw that for this last piece you played, where saying, well, it's okay to have Rudy Giuliani go do that. So the president can send whoever he wants to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the United States. To some extent, there's a point there. The presidents have directed officials outside government to do things for them. You think of people who've gone to negotiate the releases of hostages in North Korea. The difference, of course, is that what Rudy Giuliani was doing was not acting in the national interest of the United States. He was acting in the personal political interests of the president, and then getting others inside the government to do the same thing. And that's the thing they haven't been able to define in a way that should be acceptable to the American people or to Republican senators yet.
I really want to get both Heidi and Jill in real quick before we have to go to break. So I want to get these in real fast. We had the Sondland testimony still ongoing. Heidi up there on Capitol Hill. It strikes me, and I mentioned this when we started the block here, that a week ago, 2 weeks ago, the notion that the Trump administration would enact a policy of stonewalling and hold everybody back, given the history where they have invoked that policy in the past and been successful, seemed like there was a chance that a lot of these people wouldn't come forward because they'd be afraid of retribution from the White House or whatever. And now you not only have seen most of them come forward, or many of them come forward, but you are seeing them come forward and offer damaging account after damaging account. I just want to quote from Sondland's opening statement today. He says in his statement, all my actions involving Ukraine had the blessing of Secretary Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo sent me a congratulatory note that I was doing great work, and he encouraged me to keep banging away. The Sondland testimony, a couple days ago, even people thought, well, Sondland might try to, protect Trump, not trying to protect Trump, not trying to protect Pompeo. What is it you think that's driving this dynamic where the stone wall that has so protected Trump in the past 2.5 years is suddenly crumbling?
I think it is the bravery of the individuals who came in the first place. They saw that they were kind of paving the way for everyone else. And to your point of that dam breaking, now yesterday, NBC News confirmed exclusively that Bill Taylor, who is the acting ambassador to Ukraine, also hopped a flight because he is so eager to come here and give his own deposition. This one, I think, is going to be really critical because he's going to be able to not only describe the pressure campaign that was coming from the White House, but the understanding from the Ukrainians and the panic that ensued in Ukraine when it became clear that the Quid not only was this White House meeting, but that then in September, military aid was being withheld. So Bill Taylor will be able to provide a unique perspective that some of these other witnesses up until now have not provided, which is the Ukrainian understanding of the quid pro quo.
Right. So, Jill, about a week ago or so, I was talking to John Dean, and John Dean made the analogy. He said, that basically the whistleblower was the tapes, or that he was the whistleblower. There had kind of similar functions in the Watergate scandal versus this scandal. Now we don't just have a whistleblower, even though some Republicans on the Hill are still trying to say, oh, we got to see the whistleblower. We got to know who that person is before we go forward. We don't just have the whistleblower or the tapes or John Dean. We've got essentially the equivalent of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Liddy, Colson, Hunt, all basically, if you go back to Watergate, the equivalent of them all deciding to go up to Capitol Hill in front of the Senate Watergate Committee and give testimony attacking, criticizing, undermining Richard Nixon. I've never seen anything quite like this, where it's not just like one piece of devastating evidence, but all the president's men, in some sense, not the ones at the high level, not the Mick Mulvaneys of the world, although in some ways Mulvaney too, but a lot of them are effectively turning against the president before our eyes.
John, you are completely correct. But I think I see this as something that built from something smaller, much like Watergate did. It started actually with one of the burglars. Before his sentencing, he said, I'm writing a letter to the judge, and I'm going to say, and he did say, that people higher up in the White House were involved, that lies had been committed during the trial. And that was sort of the first break. And then that led to other witnesses, John Dean most remarkably, coming forward and saying, I want to tell the truth. And it just built. the speed with which this is changing right now is really dramatic. It's a totally different set of facts. The American people are understanding that this was an exchange for the benefit of the president with no concern for the benefit of America. And as we start the evidence mounting, and Taylor will be, I think, a very significant witness. I think Sondland could be as well. I can't wait to see the full text of what they're saying, but I think it is really starting a steamroller. And we now have, the whistleblower is completely unimportant because, as Adam Schiff said, you now have the best evidence. You have the actual language of the conversation. The whistleblower said, this is what I heard about the conversation. Now you have the president saying, this is what the conversation was, and it is very damaging to President Trump.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.